On the 1st of May 1982, the Argentine Navy and the Royal Navy were in a standoff over the Falkland Islands, which had been invaded and occupied by Argentina. A Royal Navy task force had created a total exclusion zone within a 20 nautical mile radius of the islands, so as to prevent further Argentine vessels or aircraft from reaching the Falklands. This fleet was centered around two aircraft carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, which were operating 38 jet aircraft against 100-odd jets available to the Argentine forces. In response to the British Task Force, the Argentine Navy deployed in 3 battle groups. To the northwest was Argentina's sole aircraft carrier, the 25 de Mayo, with its destroyer escorts, as well as a battle group of 3 frigates. To the southwest was the cruiser General Belgrano with its escorts. These fleet groups were shadowed by patrolling British nuclear submarines operating forward of the main task force. At first, both sides attempted air raids with varying levels of success. Sea Harrier bombing attacks on the airfield at Port Stanley caused infrastructure damage and destroyed Argentine aircraft. A series of raids on the task force were intercepted and repulsed by Sea Harrier combat patrols, downing 2 Argentine Mirage jets, a Dagger jet, and a Canberra bomber. The conflict escalated on the following day, the 2nd of May 1982. Bad weather prevented the task force from approaching Port Stanley for bombardment or undertaking any aerial strike missions. To the south, however, the nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror maintained contact with the General Belgrano while remaining undetected. Intercepted communications suggested that the Argentines were planning a pincer attack on the task force, in which carrier-based aircraft from the 25 de Mayo would strike from the north, while the General Belgrano fleet group would approach from the south. The Belgrano's destroyer escorts carried Exocet anti-ship missiles, which posed a significant threat to task force vessels if they were allowed within launching range. To complicate matters further, the Argentine fleet group was moving towards the Birdwood Bank, an area of shallow seabed to the south of the Falkland Islands. HMS Conqueror would be unable to follow here, allowing the Belgrano fleet group to approach the task force without being spotted. Task Force Commander Rear Admiral Woodward therefore ordered Conqueror to attack the Belgrano and prevent it from moving any closer to the British ships. However, the rules of engagement only allowed for British forces to fire upon targets once they had entered the total exclusion zone. Clearance was therefore needed from the government for Conqueror to strike. Fresh rules of engagement were agreed upon by the War Cabinet, and the task force was instructed that all vessels positively identified as Argentine combat vessels may be attacked. By this time, the Belgrano had reversed its course and was heading back westwards. The pincer attack had been aborted because low winds in the north made it impossible for the Argentine carrier to launch its aircraft. The General Belgrano was now 36 miles outside the exclusion zone, but with fresh instructions having been issued, Conqueror closed in on the ship, looking for an opportunity to strike. At 2:57 p.m. local time on May the 2nd, the submarine fired 3 torpedoes at the Belgrano from a distance of only 1,400 yards. The first torpedo hit the rear of the ship, lifting it into the air and causing a fireball to blast through the ship's aft decks. The second torpedo hit just forward of the front turret. General Belgrano began to take on water rapidly and was evacuated as it began to sink. Within 45 minutes, the ship had gone under. Destroyer escorts attacked contacts picked up by sonar with depth charges, but Conqueror had already made its escape by this time. The escorts then returned to pick up survivors, whose life rafts had scattered in the bad weather. 880 crewmen were eventually rescued, but 321 were killed in the attack. This event was the single largest loss of life during the entire Falklands War, accounting for almost half of the 649 Argentine deaths during the conflict. Following this disaster, all Argentine ships returned to port, where they remained for the rest of the war. The threat of submarine attack was deemed to be too great. This also meant that Argentine aircraft now had no choice but to operate from bases on the mainland rather than from their carrier. By the 3rd of May 1982, the Argentine forces had suffered a large setback while being unable to strike at the British Task Force. On the 4th of May, however, the Argentines had their chance to retaliate. Improved weather meant that aerial raids from the mainland could now commence. The task force was now situated 60 miles to the south of the islands, where it was located by Argentine reconnaissance aircraft. 3 Type 42 destroyers, HMS Sheffield, HMS Coventry, and HMS Glasgow, were deployed forward of the main fleet as radar pickets, meant to detect and warn of the presence of hostile aircraft before they reached the rest of the fleet. The other destroyers and frigates were deployed behind them as lines of defense against submarine or aerial attacks. In the rear were the 2 carriers, each protected by a Type 22 frigate. These were armed with Sea Wolf surface-to-air missiles. Sea Harriers were patrolling the area to the southwest of the task force to detect and intercept any aerial attacks. At 9:45 a.m. on the 4th of May, 2 Exocet-armed Super Étendard jets took off from the Rio Grande Air Base and made their way towards the task force from the west. The Argentines were operating 2 Type 42 destroyers of their own, purchased from the United Kingdom in the 1970s, and were therefore familiar with the ship's capabilities. The radar system on the Type 42 was designed to detect aircraft operating at high altitude, making it vulnerable to low-altitude attacks. The 2 Super Étendards dropped down to 30 meters above the sea as they approached the radar picket, bringing them into Exocet range of the British destroyers while being undetected. They then rapidly climbed up to 300 meters in order to launch the missiles, where they were picked up by HMS Glasgow's radar. But it was now too late. Just under 25 miles from the destroyer picket line, the planes launched their Exocets and immediately turned around for home. The first Exocet hit HMS Sheffield amidships, just meters above the waterline, and exploded, causing a fire which engulfed the ship in black smoke. The second Exocet missed its target and splashed harmlessly into the sea. Sheffield's crew attempted to fight the fire on the ship for nearly 4 hours, but the principal firefighting systems had been badly damaged and had been rendered ineffective. With the fire spreading towards the ship's magazines, the crew abandoned ship and were picked up by the nearby frigates HMS Arrow and HMS Yarmouth. 20 crew were killed and a further 24 were wounded. Fires on the ship burned themselves out over the next few days, but Sheffield was still lost when it sank under tow due to bad weather on the 10th of May. Despite the abortive early raids and the loss of the General Belgrano, Argentine forces had demonstrated that they were no pushover, and that the amphibious landing on the Falklands was going to be a hard-fought, bloody affair.